What is the difference between the discussion and the conclusion in your PhD? Maybe you've got to the writing up stage and you're getting a bit muddled about what goes where. You're wondering, where does the discussion end and the conclusion begin? You write the conclusion and it just sounds like a summary of the discussion. And the whole thing can begin getting messy and repetitive. And let's be honest, this is the last thing you need right now, because by the time you get to this stage, you're kind of tired. By the time we get to the end of this video, I want you to feel more confident and more certain about what belongs where. Let's get into it. Before we even get on to the difference between these two chapters, it's worth just spending a little bit of time thinking about why this stage of the PhD feels so difficult. A lot of researchers get to this stage and think, surely, if I was doing this properly, everything would feel much clearer by now. Actually, hate to be the one to break this to you, but this final stage in the PhD can often feel the messiest and the most confusing. Because what you're trying to do here is different from what you've done in the previous stages of the doctoral journey. What you are now attempting to do is piece all of this together, to look at it as a coherent whole. You're trying to understand what your findings suggest, how they connect to existing research, what contribution the thesis is making, and how all of the different parts of your project actually fit together. That requires a very different kind of intellectual work. One of the most important things to realise at this stage is the discussion chapter is about meaning. It's not about data. The reason I say that is because many people get to this point, and because it doesn't happen quickly or easily or coherently, there's a tendency to assume there's something wrong with their data, and that's not the case at all. Another thing that gets kind of misdiagnosed here is structure. So people assume that if the discussion is difficult to write, that if they just get the structure in place, if they just get a nice template, that everything will be fine. But it's not really about structure either. The deeper problem, the issue underneath the surface here, is often that you're trying to take many years of what can be quite fragmented thinking and turn that into a coherent argument. And that's not easy, because some of the things that you've done, some of the chapters you've completed and the thinking that you've done around them, that happened years ago. You might be in a different place now in terms of how you understand things in relation to your topic. So you look back over what you've done months or years ago, and sometimes these sections and chapters feel like they've been written by a different person, like a past version of your PhD self. And you're like, how do I bring this all together without dismantling it and doing it all again? Some of the common worries here include things like, what if I don't have a real contribution? What if I've misunderstood the literature? What if the literature has caught up with me and overtaken me and somebody else has already done this? What if my conclusions just sound too obvious? And what am I actually allowed to say here? Now, pause for a moment and just remember this. You are in the difficult work of intellectual integration. And things will get messier before they get tidier. That is completely normal, but you just need to be prepared for it, okay? The easiest way to think about the difference between your findings, the discussion, and the conclusion is that each of those different chapters are answering separate questions. The findings chapter answers the question, what did I find? The discussion chapter answers the question, what does this mean in relation to what we already know? And the conclusion answers the question, where does this leave the thesis overall? For example, say you've been researching people who change careers in their 40s, specifically people who left the legal profession and moved into something completely unrelated. and you were interested in how they experienced changes in their professional identity. Your findings chapter might tell us what participants described. Things like loss of status, relief after leaving the law, uncertainty around identity, pressure from family, or difficulty explaining their career change to others. But the discussion chapter would then ask, what do these experiences mean? So this is where you'd start exploring things like this: how professional identity becomes linked to self-worth, why leaving prestigious careers can create a kind of identity disruption, how existing literature on identity transition helps explain these experiences, or how your findings complicate common assumptions about career change as something being purely liberating. Then the conclusion chapter comes along and it asks, what does this thesis overall help us understand? Maybe the broader conclusion is that career change in midlife is not simply an economic or a practical transition, but it's a deeply relational and identity-based process that the existing career change literature often underestimates. So here we can see the findings tell us what happened, the discussion explores what it means, and the conclusion draws together what the thesis as a whole now helps us understand more clearly. The discussion chapter is usually where people start feeling really overwhelmed. There's quite a lot of pressure, isn't there? The stakes are quite high because this is where your research becomes an argument. That's different from what was going on in your findings, where your job was to largely present what had emerged from the data. But in the discussion chapter, your job becomes interpretation, explanation, positioning, and meaning making. You are now asking, what do these findings suggest? How do they relate to existing literature? Do they support, complicate, extend, or challenge our existing understandings of this? What patterns or tensions matter the most here? And this is where many PhD researchers suddenly start to feel really unsure of themselves. Because the discussion chapter, it requires judgment. You're no longer simply reporting, you are making interpretive decisions. You're no longer just noticing and observing what's going on, you're being asked to explain it. So going back to our career change example for a moment, this is where you stop simply reporting that participants felt uncertainty after leaving the law, and you start asking what that uncertainty actually represents. Is it a loss of identity? Is it a loss of status? A disruption in how people understand themselves professionally? That shift from description into interpretation, that is the discussion chapter. That's why discussion chapters often feel a lot harder than the analysis itself. One of the biggest myths about the PhD discussion chapter is that it's supposed to be this whiz-bang, fireworks in the background, here's my huge, massive, paradigm-shifting contribution to knowledge type chapter. A strong discussion includes these things: careful, bounded claims, acknowledgement of complexity, and a clear explanation as to why your interpretation is a reasonable one. So in our example, you probably wouldn't claim, this study proves all career changes in midlife create identity crises. That would be far too broad. But you might reasonably argue that your findings suggest professional identity can remain psychologically significant long after people leave prestigious occupations. That is a much more careful, defensible, discussion level claim. Quick question before we move on. What feels hardest for you right now in your discussion chapter? Understanding what belongs where? Avoiding repeating yourself? Actually trusting your judgment enough to write the discussion chapter, or something else altogether? Get into the comments and let me know. And if my videos are helping you feel calmer and clearer in your PhD journey and you want to support this channel, you can do so by clicking here. Now let's move on to the conclusion chapter. This is where a lot of people, accidentally continue discussing rather than concluding. The conclusion chapter is not there to offer new analysis, okay? It's not there to summarise all of the previous chapters either. Your conclusion chapter is about synthesis, perspective, and closure. Earlier chapters zoomed in, the conclusion zooms out. In your discussion chapter, you ask the question, what do these findings mean? In the conclusion chapter, you're asking the question, what does this thesis overall contribute towards our understanding? Once you understand that, the whole architecture of the thesis begins to feel a lot clearer. The conclusion is where you help your reader see the overall argument, the broader significance, the contribution, and what your study leaves us with. In our example study, the conclusion might step back and say something like this. What this thesis ultimately helps us understand is that career change in midlife is not simply a practical transition, but a deeply identity-based and relational process that existing discussions of career mobility often underestimate. Now, one thing I really want to normalise here is this. There will probably be a little bit of overlap between your discussion and your conclusion, because both chapters are trying to make sense of the work. Your job is not to try and remove every repeated idea. It's to make sure that each chapter has a distinct intellectual purpose. The discussion is about interpretation. The conclusion is about synthesis and closure. And that distinction matters more than achieving these perfectly sealed off chapters, because doctoral qualitative work is very rarely linear. You rethink ideas, you restructure arguments. Theory gets clearer during analysis rather than before it. And connections between important things in your data often emerge retrospectively. You don't see them at the time. It's only later on, when you're putting it all back together, that you go, ah. Clarity often emerges after you've written more than you'll eventually keep. A lot of that won't end up in your thesis. That writing was essentially thinking work. Usually, the argument emerges through the writing itself, not before it. And this is often why people feel that the discussion and the conclusion parts of their thesis are starting to merge together. That's not necessarily confusion. Often it is your argument becoming clear, and that is the middle of that process. Now, hold on to these two questions. Screenshot them, write them down somewhere. The discussion chapter asks this question. What do these findings mean in relation to what we already know? The conclusion chapter asks this question. So where does this leave the thesis overall? Hopefully now you can see that these two chapters are not interchangeable. The discussion interprets what the findings mean. The conclusion steps back and explains what the thesis overall now helps us understand. Those are related tasks, they're not the same task. Appearing on your screen right now is another video that will really help you out if you're in the closing stages of your PhD thesis. So go and check it out. I'll see you in there.